In today's video, I'm going to do a quick comparison of 4 different budget CPU cooler options when paired with both the AMD Ryzen 5 5600X and the AMD Ryzen 7 5700X 3D. I've done quite a few videos recently that have involved the Ryzen 5 5600X in some way, including a video going over the best GPU options to pair with the 5600X, and I put together a couple of budget gaming PC builds that have used the 5600X in them as well. So I thought it would be good to see how the 5600X does when paired with a handful of budget-oriented coolers and compare the performance to the stock cooler that the CPU comes with. I also have the Ryzen 7 5700X 3D, which I think is the most sensible CPU upgrade option for users who have a system that currently has the 5600X in it. The 5700X 3D does run a bit hotter than the 5600X though, and so I want to see if any of these budget coolers can handle it well enough, and also see if the stock cooler that comes with the 5600X will work for the higher end CPU as well. So let's first start by going over what CPU coolers we'll be testing. First, we have the ever popular Thermalright Peerless Assassin 120 SE, which is a dual tower CPU cooler that comes with 2 120mm fans, and it has a 6 heat pipe design. This cooler can currently be had for right about $34 on Amazon. We also have Thermalright's Burst Assassin 120 SE, which is a single tower CPU cooler that comes with a single 120mm fan and a 6 heat pipe design. The Burst Assassin is available for right around $24 on Amazon right now. Then we have the smaller ID Cooling SC903XT, which is a smaller single tower cooler that comes with a 92mm fan and a 3 heat pipe design. This cooler is currently available for just $15 on Amazon. And finally, we'll also use the basic stock cooler that comes with the Ryzen 5 5600X. For our thermals test, we just ran each processor and cooler combination in Cinebench's multi-core CPU test and also in Starfield. Starfield is a game where I've seen both the CPU and GPU hit high utilizations. That creates a lot of heat in the system, and so I chose it for this test. There is probably better games out there to test CPU temps, but I have Starfield and thought it would be good enough to use for this comparison video. The case we used for our test is Okeanos' Cypress 7 mid-tower case. It's got a mesh front panel, 3 120mm fans on the front of the case, and 1 120mm fan on the back of the case, so a fairly common case layout, and one that should offer better than average thermals when compared to the rest of the PC case market, thanks to all of those pre-installed fans. Now, this wasn't really the most scientific of thermal testing. I didn't have a perfectly climate-controlled room, and I just ran everything at stock settings. By running everything at stock settings, there will be some wiggle room on the thermals for each of these coolers, as more aggressive profiles could bring temps down a bit more as well. But with all of that being said, let's just get into the results. For the 5600X with the stock cooler, in Cinebench's multi-core CPU test, the 5600X averaged 77.2 degrees Celsius and hit a peak temperature of 83.8 degrees Celsius. In Starfield, the 5600X reached a peak of 87 degrees Celsius at CPU usages of up to 87%. So the 5600X ran a little bit hotter when running Starfield due to our RX 7800XT dumping extra heat into the case. This seems like decent results for the stock cooler though, as the 5600X can go all the way up to 95 degrees Celsius before it will throttle. It did get fairly hot in Starfield, but Starfield is on the extreme side of things as most games won't utilize your CPU as much. Admittedly, our case setup with 4 pre-installed fans and a mesh front panel probably helps the stock cooler out a lot here, and if I were to use the 5600X and stock cooler in a more restrictive case, these numbers would almost assuredly be higher. So I think if you do want to save some money by just sticking with the stock cooler for the 5600X, it would be worth it to make sure you choose a case that has good airflow out of the box. Unfortunately, there are budget-friendly case options out there, like the Montech Air 100 for instance, that offer multiple pre-installed fans and a mesh front panel to help with airflow. Jumping up to the ID Cooling SC903XT, I saw significantly better CPU temps in Cinebench and Starfield. In Cinebench, the small single tower ID Cooling cooler kept the 5600X at an average temperature of 69.1 degrees Celsius with a peak temperature of 73.2 degrees Celsius. And in Starfield, the CPU peaked at 76 degrees Celsius. So despite it being a smaller single tower cooler, the ID Cooling SC903XT was able to cut down the temperature on the 5600X by a significant margin over the stock cooler, providing 10 to 15% lower temperatures and pushing us far enough away from AMD's maximum temperatures for the 5600X that we can feel very confident that this cooler is more than adequate enough for the 5600X. And you get those superior thermals for just $15. The only real downside of the SC903XT was that it got very loud under load, but there was plenty of headroom to tweak the fan curve to bring those noise levels down and still maintain above average thermals. Next, we moved up to the more traditional size single tower cooler in Thermalright's Burst Assassin. With a bigger fan and heatsink, and with more heat pipes, the Burst Assassin was able to provide a significant decrease in temperatures when compared to the smaller ID cooling cooler. The Burst Assassin provided an average temperature of 61.7 degrees Celsius in Cinebench's multi-core CPU test, and the maximum temperature the 5600X reached was just 66.1 degrees. In Starfield, the Burst Assassin helped keep the 5600X running cool with a peak temperature of 69 degrees. So that's 10 to 15% lower temperatures for the Burst Assassin over the ID cooling cooler at a cost of an additional $10. Again, the ID cooling cooler comes in at about $15, and the Burst Assassin can be had for about $24. Finally, I tested the $34 Thermalright Peerless Assassin with the Ryzen 5 5600X. This dual tower cooler was able to provide noticeably better thermals than when compared to the Burst Assassin, keeping the 5600X at an average temperature of 58 degrees Celsius with a peak temperature of just 62.4 degrees in Cinebench. And in Starfield, the 5600X peaked at 65 degrees Celsius. So that's about 5% lower temperatures than the Burst Assassin provided. However, those results were with both Thermalright coolers operating at the stock settings. I'm sure we can get even better thermals out of the Peerless Assassin if we optimize the fan curve for performance. But if you are looking for a cooler for the 5600X, you will have to ask yourself if you really need to spend extra on something like the Peerless Assassin when there are cheaper options like the Burst Assassin and ID cooling SC903XT that will get the job done for $10 to $20 cheaper. For the Ryzen 7 5700X 3D though, it's a different story, as this higher end CPU option runs quite a bit hotter than the 5600X. To start our testing for the 5700X 3D, I decided to see if the stock cooler from the 5600X could handle the higher end CPU, as I'm assuming there are people out there who will want to upgrade from the 5600X or 5600, and they might be wondering whether they'll need to purchase a CPU cooler to go with it, or if they can just keep the stock cooler that came with their older Ryzen processor. In the Cinebench multi-core CPU test, the stock cooler really struggled to handle the 5700X 3D with an average temperature of 89.3 degrees Celsius, and it hit a maximum temperature of 91.2 degrees Celsius. The 5700X 3D throttles at 90 degrees Celsius, so the 5700X 3D was definitely limited by the 5600X's stock cooler at full load. In Starfield, the 5700X 3D hit a max temperature of 86 degrees Celsius, but that is because the 5700X 3D didn't hit utilizations as high as the 5600X did due to the fact that it's a much stronger CPU. Where the 5600X hit a CPU usage of as high as 85% in Starfield, the 5700X 3D only hit up to 68%. So for real-world gaming use cases, you could maybe get away with running the 5700X 3D on the 5600X's stock cooler, especially since most games won't utilize the CPU as much as Starfield does. But considering how close we were to the 5700X 3D's maximum temperature, and also how cheap some of these single tower CPU coolers are, I would recommend spending the $20 or so to get a better cooler to have peace of mind that your CPU will stay well within the 5700X 3D's normal operating temperatures. With the 5600X's stock cooler out of the question for the 5700X 3D, I wanted to see how the cheap $15 ID cooling SC903XT could handle the hotter CPU. This cooler was able to keep the 5700X 3D's average temperature under 80 degrees Celsius in Cinebench at 78.1 degrees, but it did hit a peak temperature of 82.8 degrees. Again, temps in Starfield are going to be relatively lower on the 5700X 3D than they were on the 5600X, because the 5700X 3D is strong enough to not require a higher utilization, but Starfield did peak at 74 degrees with the 5700X 3D and ID cooling cooler combination. So that's significantly better thermals than the 5600X's stock cooler provided for the 5700X 3D, and the ID cooling cooler was able to keep the 5700X 3D well within normal operating temperatures. Moving on to the slightly bigger and more expensive Thermalright Burst Assassin, The 5700X3D operated much cooler with an average temperature of 72.1 degrees Celsius and a peak temperature of 76.4 degrees. In Starfield, the Burst Assassin kept the 5700X3D to a maximum of 70 degrees Celsius. So the Burst Assassin was able to deliver solid thermals for the 5700X3D with close to 10% lower temperatures than the ID cooling cooler was able to provide. That seems like a worthwhile upgrade for just $10, especially when you consider that the Burst Assassin operates much more quietly and it gave the 5700X3D a lot of headroom to work with to cover the most extreme scenarios. Finally, we paired the bigger Peerless Assassin with the 5700X3D. The Peerless Assassin was able to keep the 5700X3D very cool during Cinebench's multi-core CPU test, with an average temperature of 68.5 degrees Celsius and a peak temperature of 72.5 degrees. And in Starfield, the CPU never went above 65 degrees Celsius. So really good performance overall, and again, I didn't try to optimize the cooling performance by tweaking the fan curve, so there's probably even better thermals to be had. But where I would say the Peerless Assassin is a bit overkill for the 5600X, it is a really good pairing for the 5700X3D. So to sum it up, I think if you're building a new system with a very tight budget, and you're going to go with the Ryzen 5 5600X or 5600, you can save some money by sticking with the stock cooler that it comes with. Of course, there are going to be variables to that where the stock cooler might not be the best option for you. If you live in a hotter climate and you have trouble keeping your room cool, sticking with the stock cooler might not be a great option. Also, I used a case that comes with 4 120mm fans pre-installed and a mesh front panel, which likely helped deliver improved thermals for the 5600X with the stock cooler. So if you're looking to get a more compact case or a case that doesn't have as good of airflow, it would make sense to consider a better cooling solution than AMD's stock cooler. However, for just $15 to $35, you can significantly improve the temperatures your 5600X operates at by opting for any of the other 3 coolers shown in this video. As we saw, the $15 ID Cooling SE903XT is good enough to handle the 5600X with no problems. The $24 Thermalright Burst Assassin is even better for just a little bit more. And if you want as low of thermals as possible without completely breaking the bank, the Thermalright Peerless Assassin would be worth considering. In my opinion though, the Peerless Assassin is probably a bit overkill for the 5600X unless you're planning ahead for a CPU upgrade in the future. For the 5700X3D, the stock cooler that comes with the 5600X or 5600 is not a viable option. So if you have an older AM4 CPU and you're looking to upgrade to the 5700X3D, just note that you'll need to add a better cooler to your system as well. Fortunately, as we saw from these tests, even something like the $15 ID Cooling cooler can keep the 5700X3D within normal operating temperatures. However, for just $10 to $20 more, you have options like Thermalright's Burst Assassin and Peerless Assassin, both of which will keep the 5700X3D running very cool even under more extreme loads, and neither will get quite as loud as that ID Cooling cooler. Ultimately, you don't need to spend a lot to get a viable cooler for either of these CPUs, and hopefully this video has helped you determine the kind of cooling you'll need for both options. And while the Thermalright Peerless Assassin is one of the only affordable dual tower coolers, there are a lot of single tower coolers in the $20 price range, like the Thermalright Burst Assassin, so you have more options out there available to you than just the one I used. But in any case, that does it for this quick comparison video. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you next time.